There once was a little boy growing up in East Bakersfield in a blended, complicated family. For no apparent reason, almost from birth, it seemed none of the men in his life accepted the boy. Father, stepfather, grandfather, none seemed to embrace baby James. Family members say, inexplicably, the men were downright cruel to the child, as if there was something about him, something that just made him different from his siblings and cousins. Those invisible differences led to continued mistreatment, only a little of which made it into police reports. Incidents such as being tied to a tree and whipped at 5 years old by an angry stepfather, and having a brick thrown at him at age 8 by his uncle. Then there are the reported incidents of psychological abuse, such as having food withheld from him while being forced to sit at the dinner table, watching his siblings eat, and when finally given food, being forced to eat it off the floor like a dog. Most of that abuse is documented only through memories of his family members, all of whom agree James was born into a very painful life. But you already know little James, and the man he grew up to be is not the victim in this story.
Some criminals are made, some are born, but most it's a combination, and all make choices.
He didn't come out of the womb, an evil killer or whatever they're saying. He was a normal, loving kid.
I'm Olivia LaVoice. This is The Man with 1,000 Faces. After I managed to get crime scene photos from the latest, very gruesome murder Jaime Osuna is accused of, I had to put the photos somewhere less obvious than my phone's camera roll. I'm not supposed to have them, for one thing. Also, it'd be very unpleasant if any unsuspecting person was scrolling through my phone and stumbled upon them. Trust me, you can't unsee these. Anyhow, I put them into a folder on my phone where I'd stored other photos of Jaime. Some happened to be his baby photos. And when I recently went to open that folder, there it was, the most graphic of the crime scene photos, directly next to a photo of Jaime as a child, posing in front of a paint-splattered backdrop, sitting on a paint can. He's probably 6 years old here. Maybe it's his kindergarten photo, maybe first grade. He's got his hair combed to one side and a big toothy grin. Next to him is a big bucket of red paint spilled onto the floor. Looking at that photo next to the crime scene photo with blood covering every inch of the floor of a prison cell is a juxtaposition forever etched into my brain. But not every photo of young Jaime seems that morbid. In most of them, he looks like a regular, happy, innocent little boy.
How did that little kid, that I saw, how does that, and that's a kid, a kid could play with trucks, you do kid stuff, and now, he's this murderer. It was just very surreal, and it was like, this only happens in the movies, this doesn't happen in real life.
That's a distant relative of Jaime's. You'll hear from her more later on. She is one of the many people I've contacted and more or less dropped a bombshell on, giving them a history lesson on their family tree they never asked for or wanted. The relative whose perspective we'll start with is the woman who told me this.
I could trade places with him, I would.
But you didn't kill anyone.
In a way, I did.
Jaime's mother, Michelle.
Because I allowed that to happen. This is what happened after me not protecting my son.
The research I've done, very few people are born evil. It's rare. I believe it's nurture over nature with Jaime.
That was Jaime's ex-wife. Is her take on it really possible? Can a baby be brought into the world, pure, innocent, not knowing hate, and be made into a monster? Or was this always his path? Was he born with evil in his mind? If anyone might know, I figured it'd be world-renowned forensic psychologist Kris Mohandie. So I gathered up all my documents and a tape of my jailhouse interview with Jaime and went to Los Angeles.
I've been practicing for about 25 plus years.
Mohandie is the face of forensic psychology, at least as far as network television goes, and for good reason. He's consulted with the FBI's behavioral analysis program and worked on hundreds of cases, ranging from serial killers to O.J. Simpson and the murders of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman. Basically, he's seen it all. And getting to the root of why someone is, well, evil is his thing.
My number one question is, when you have someone like Mr. Osuna, how do you determine if they were born that way or if they were made into that person?
The question of nature versus nurture, did the environment cause it or were they simply born genetically bad, is often raised in cases like this of Mr. Osuna. And the truth is, most cases, it's a mix of the environment intersecting with some biological predispositions.
Let's start from the beginning, 1988. Jamie's mother, Michelle, is 19 years old. His father is 21. They didn't really have a dime to their names, but they had something Michelle considered a blessing. They were expecting their first, and as it turns out, their only child together, Jamie, often called James. It helped offset what Michelle already knew. Jamie's father was not a good man.
When I was pregnant with James, I was almost full term. He kicked me in my stomach, and that's why Jamie has that dent in one of his ears, on his earlobe, because it struck a nerve or something, the doctor said. But yeah, he was abusive as well.
They separated when Jamie was still an infant. Not long after their breakup, Jamie's father was arrested for holding a 12-inch knife to the throat of the new man in Michelle's life. That police report is the end of the paper trail for Jamie's father being in the picture. By the time Jamie was a year old, Michelle says she was married to that new man, Jeff. They were poor, barely scraping by, but they were trying to make their blended family work. Michelle, her older son, and baby Jamie moved in with Jeff. By the time Jamie was a year old, Michelle was married to that new man, Jeff. They were poor, barely scraping by, but they were trying to make their blended family work. Michelle, her older son, and baby Jamie moved in with Jeff. Michelle says right off the bat it was apparent. Jeff didn't want her two boys. He certainly had no intentions of being a father figure. She recalls one of the first incidents of where this was made abundantly clear.
We were coming back, I believe it was from a fishing trip, and we were traveling, and Jamie was still in car seat age, and he was back there whining and crying, and because he needed to be changed, that's what it was, and he was whining and crying, and I guess to his point of view, it was on his nerves. So he reached back, opened up the back door, and pushed him out, car seat and all. And there was a truck coming, so I made him slow down. I jumped out of the car and went and got him from off the street.
Did you bring Jamie to the hospital after that?
No. What happened was he landed upright, sitting down. I don't know how that happened, but when I went to get him, he was sitting upright. And no, I didn't take him. He wouldn't take me. He said, no, he's fine.
Michelle says Jeff was abusive to her older son as well, but it didn't last long. She says after Jeff threw a fork at the child and it stabbed him, that son moved in with Michelle's parents. Jamie's ex-wife explains the impact that had on young Jamie.
He just said he would pray to God, and God never answered. He prayed to go with his grandmother. He still continued to get abused.
Jamie wasn't rescued the way his older brother was from that home. But why? Why wouldn't his grandparents take in both boys? Jamie's other half-brother, Kurt, who is the biological son of Jeff, Jamie's stepdad, provides some insight.
My grandfather hated him, never liked him.
Jamie was a little kid, a toddler. How could someone hate him? We don't know, but several family members, most of whom didn't want to be recorded for this story, told me the same thing. Jaime was hated by his grandfather and forced to stay in the home with Jeff, the abusive stepfather, because of it. Nobody knows why Jeff couldn't embrace the child either.
Jaime was a loving child. And when he would come up to me and hug me and, things like that, Jeff always had a problem with that too. Try to keep me from showing Jaime love, that's what he would do.
What would he say to you?
Not to put my child before him, that he came first. I'd have to hug him behind his back, let's put it that way. I have to show him love behind his back, to where he wasn't seeing it. One time he threw him outside with no shoes on when it was raining, threw him outside. And Jeff was in the bathroom upstairs, and he threw him outside, in the back where you can look down from the bathroom window and see James. And James was just pounding on the door to come in, let me in. And so my husband got the window and he slammed the bathroom window, and it broke. All the glass fell on Jaime and cut him up everywhere to where he had to go to the hospital and get stitches. Yes, it was done intentionally.
In a rare documented incident, police reports illustrate a moment when Michelle says she did stand up to Jeff.
Jaime spilt juice or something like that on the floor, and Jeff got upset about it. And he turned around and he tied him up in rope and then started whipping him with the belt.
For the first and only time, she called 911. By the time police arrived, 5-year-old Jaime was untied, but the rope marks on his body were still visible. Jeff told officers he was kidding around with the rope and hit Jaime, quote, only one good time. Jeff was arrested and pleaded guilty to child cruelty and inflicting injury on a child. He was back home with Jaime and Michelle within days. By this time, Jeff and Michelle had 2 children of their own. By all accounts, Jeff was crazy about his children. Here's Jeff's sister to explain.
He loved those 2 kids. Amazingly crazy love. He'd do anything for them and talk about them all the time.
Michelle says that love for his own children only made his disdain for his stepson Jaime more apparent.
The kids would be eating dinner and I would serve the kids, and he wouldn't let James have his, and then would take away his plate and then have Jaime sit there and watch his 2 kids eat while he sat there with nothing.
And she says when Jeff finally let Jaime have something to eat,
he made him eat like a dog. Just put his plate on the floor and make him eat on the floor.
How did you deal with that?
I didn't deal with it too well. I didn't know how to deal with it because, like I said, by that time, the abuse had turned on me as well. So I didn't know how to deal with it.
Would you ever say to Jeff, why are you doing this?
I questioned him a lot till he put such a fright in me to where I wouldn't even question him anymore.
Jeff had a domestic abuse conviction from a previous marriage, but Michelle never reported him. I asked her about that.
Did you think that if you left Jeff, he would kill you?
He told me he would. Nothing that I think. He told me he would.
She's almost monotone when she describes him whipping her with a belt and literally pouring salt into her wounds. She doesn't focus much on those memories. Her mind is occupied with memories of Jaime and what he endured.
Jaime was a different story, because he could not defend himself. So that was a different story.
How hard is it to think about that?
Harder now because of what's going on and where he's at, and knowing that I was a weak person and could have stopped all of that before it got really bad with Jaime, and I didn't.
When Jaime was 12 years old, he began asking questions about his stepfather, Michelle couldn't answer.
Why was he so mean to him that he had a lot of time to, be a dad to me? Told him I couldn't answer that question because I didn't know why he was like that.
This is around the time Jaime was finally taken in by his grandparents, a time he may have felt his prayers to God were answered.
He wanted out, away from him, so I gave that to him.
As a preteen, now living with his very religious grandmother and the grandfather who supposedly hated him, life may have improved slightly for Jaime compared to his living situation with his mother and stepdad Jeff. But Michelle says at this time she could already feel Jaime was different, detached, no longer affectionate. By age 15, he was arrested for stabbing another boy. In a sad, ironic twist, Jaime going away was what finally pushed Michelle to leave Jeff.
That was the day Jaime got arrested for the first time and went to juvenile hall. And they came and got him. And Jeff turned around and said, I'm glad he went to jail. That's where he needs to be. Away from us. That way we can be by ourselves. And that's when I snapped.
Jaime's older half-brother, who briefly lived with Jaime, Jeff, and Michelle, didn't want to be recorded for this story. But he told me the claims of abuse about Jeff are true. He and Jaime undoubtedly took different paths. According to social media, Jaime's older brother is living a luxurious life. He has a nice big house, a beautiful wife and kids, he drives a fancy sports car, and is a successful entrepreneur. Could Jaime have had that, or something even close to it, had he gotten out of his mother's house sooner? I wanted to speak with the men in Jaime's life who supposedly rejected him almost from birth. His stepfather, Jeff, especially. But Jeff died from a heart attack in 2007. So I called someone else who I thought might have some insight.
If you didn't have proof, I would call you a bull-faced liar.
Jeff's sister, who up until getting a strange call from a stranger, being me, never had heard of her brother being abusive with anyone. And when I asked her about Jaime, it took her a minute to recall her brother's stepson, the child who'd seemingly blended into the background.
I never asked about Jaime. I just completely forgot all about him. I mean, he was just out of my world.
We're calling Jeff's sister Molly. Once Molly remembered Jaime, I attempted to explain to her that quiet little boy was the focus of my story, the reason for why I was digging up the past. Molly couldn't give me much information on her brother's relationship with Jaime, but she told me about another little boy who was abused by an angry, violent man. Jeff, Jaime's abusive stepfather, it turns out, had been abused himself as a child. Molly and Jeff had different fathers, but the same mother who worked 3 jobs to support the family. Molly said their mother was married to Jeff's father, Curtis, for a short time. Curtis was hardly ever around, but every once in a while he would show up at their home.
I remember him beating my mom. She usually told us to go run and hide. I remember that because I remember being under a piece of furniture and just watching him beat my mom down the hallway. A really hard one for me is I remember hearing and seeing him rape her in the living room on the couch.
Like Jaime's mother, Michelle, Jeff's mother didn't report Curtis. But Jeff's sister recalls one incident where police did get involved.
He took Jeff and I and threw us in the car, and we traveled to Hart Park, and he threw us both in the river there, throwing us in the river, and me swimming out of the river, getting out of the river, and then bystanders coming around and helping Jeff get out of the river. Then there was a police car, and I remember him being in the back of the police car.
Kern County court clerks told me they can't search for reports from cases prior to 1980 without a specific date, so I can't confirm the arrest. It was another unanticipated roadblock, but mostly because I didn't expect to be trying to track down allegations of child abuse where Jeff, Jamie's stepfather, was the victim. But once I started to see the pattern, a cycle, I wanted to know more. Jeff's father, Curtis, is also deceased, so I tracked down Curtis's sister, Leola. Leola couldn't tell me if Curtis was abusive to his son Jeff because, well, she said she didn't even know Jeff existed. She assured me if he did, he must have been given up for adoption.
What do they want?
Oh, nothing. It's more just I'm just trying to look back into their family history because,
Is adopted child maybe looking for their own family or something?
No, not quite. Another tough conversation to explain. I was told that Curtis, he married a woman named Barbara, and they had a son together named Jeff.
Yes.
And that Curtis supposedly one day kidnapped Jeff and his stepdaughter and threw them in the Kern River.
He wouldn't have done that.
Leola did remember Curtis's wife, Barbara, who was Jeff and Molly's mother. To clarify, Curtis's sister calls Curtis by his middle name, Lloyd.
She was a very nice lady. We was glad that she was married to Lloyd because she was a nice lady and maybe he'd have a better life, get his life straight.
Mm-hmm.
You know how you hope and pray for that.
What was wrong with his life?
He drank because he was a construction worker and a hard-working man, but he was an alcoholic.
Do you think it was abusive, though?
Well, if he was, I didn't know about it. I know he was a loving man.
Did you and Curtis have a good childhood?
Yes. My mother was left with 6 kids to raise by herself because my dad got killed when Lloyd was only like 7 or 8. I gotta help my son.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. From the few details I got, it didn't sound like a good childhood. But perhaps compared to Jeff and Jamie's, it was. Like Jamie, Jeff's father, Curtis, was never really around. Aside from maybe the dozen times, each of which Jeff's sister Molly says abuse was involved.
As a whole, we never talked about it. Definitely a time where it was never like, oh, how do you feel about that? No, we need to get you therapy. We just dealt with it however you dealt with it.
Molly knew the trauma Jeff endured as a child because she lived it with him.
He led a very different life, bouncing in and out of rentals, and you don't pay the rent, and you get kicked out, and, you get a tattoo before you pay the water bill.
Meanwhile, Molly grew up to become a teacher and an advocate for children who come from difficult backgrounds. So when I showed her court records that documented some of the abuse allegations against Jeff,
I was angry. I went past the point of the whole sympathy and empathy, and then I'm like, nope, if that's the case, then I don't care if he's my brother or not. You don't hurt children mentally or physically.
Kurt, who is Jeff's son and Jamie's younger half-brother, didn't know much about his family's history of abuse. But when I asked him this about his dad, Jeff...
Did he ever, say, that he had a tough childhood?
Yeah. I mean, he's kind of in the same boat as my brother James. They're kind of similar. They have a different dad. They have their brothers and sisters from different dads. Black sheep, and they get treated different from everybody else. The abuse, mental abuse, stuff like that.
There are undoubtedly common threads in Jeff and Jamie's backgrounds. No father figures, and having the men in their lives meant to fill that role, abuse them instead. But whenever the topic of Jamie's childhood came up with most, I found there was a much stronger emphasis on his mother, Michelle. That's how Jamie's ex-wife Jane felt.
I don't know what started this whole snowball, but Michelle, I don't pick the best men. I really don't. But Michelle has been abused pretty much by every man she's been with.
Jane said before Jamie was arrested for the Yvette Pena murder, she attended therapy with him where details of his childhood surfaced. Jane says Jamie talked about being molested, but would never say who did it, and when he would talk about the abuse by his stepdad, Jane says she always wondered if Jaime resented his mother for not doing more to stop it. Did Jaime feel his mother picked Jeff over him? If so, Jaime never said it. But someone else said it, his mother.
So you can see it as me picking him over Jaime because I did not do what I was supposed to do as a mother to protect him.
Do you still feel like you picked Jeff over Jaime?
Yes, I do. Because if I would have not done what I did and allowed this man to do what he did to Jaime would not be where he is at today.
Jaime, what was your upbringing like? I want to learn a little more about you.
My upbringing?
Yeah.
Let's see here. Well, I grew up in the east side, rough neighborhood. Didn't know my dad.
When I interviewed Jaime in 2017, this also came up about his childhood.
Since I was a kid, 8, 9 years old, I've killed animals.
We'll spare the disturbing descriptions he provided, but when it came to his mother and his stepdad Jeff, this is all he said.
I had an abusive stepfather, and my mother was hardly never around, and she would follow my stepfather, so I was always thrown to the streets.
We may never really know the extent to which his mother played in Jaime becoming a self-proclaimed remorseless killer, but forensic psychologist Kris Mohandie provided his take on the situation.
A parent, particularly a mother, is supposed to be the ultimate protector for her child, who she carried in her womb, presumably fed for all those years. And for her to abandon him, as he perceives that she did, would fuel a tremendous rage and desire for revenge. And it would be very primitive, that craving to take life. The amount of rage that would be buried deep down inside of his psyche would be unfathomable, and it would explain, how you could take lives and be so detached. He's had a lot of years to fantasize.
Fantasize? I asked Dr. Mohandie to elaborate.
You have these kinds of experiences of tremendous powerlessness and terror, and such rage at having been abandoned. Your antidote, your way of coping, apart from going numb, is to develop fantasies, little movies in your head with scenarios that you play like a movie in order to cope with those events as they're happening, or when you have memories of those events. Now, most people won't do this, but the person who is a budding killer or serial murderer will have developed these kinds of fantasies.
This brings us to the question, is it really possible that if Jaime had a different childhood, one that was happy, loving, simple, he wouldn't have his desire to take human life?
Even if there are environmental variables, it still doesn't take away the issue of personal responsibility, because most people who experience abuse or witness violence in their homes do not become violent. They make a decision, I'm not going to be that person. There's an element of free will in most of these cases in which the offender makes a decision, I'm going to yield to these urges. I'm going to embrace this dark history and become that which I've been shaped to be. I've met a number of serial killers that recognized those dark impulses and urges and saw what the implications were of living that lifestyle and said, you know what, I can't change it. I've tried not to have these thoughts, these ideas, and it was bigger than what they could handle.
That's essentially exactly what Jaime told me happened in his case.
I did grow up in an environment that did mold and shape me a certain way, with me knowing not right from wrong until I got older and recognized it. And when I recognized it, I corrected it, and I try to educate myself in clinical psychology, social psychology, and as much as self-help books as possible. I seek medication. I seeked doctors' therapy in the streets in here. So in a result to that, I see myself for what it is. I am a character of my own deeds and doings. I'm a maker of my own thoughts. My thoughts is a maker of my character. So I did have an upbringing that was probably unusual, but it doesn't follow up to me right now. There was a point where I did stop and say, this is not what, I'm not going to say normal people do, because I can't say what's normal, but obviously there was something going on, so I had to address it, and I did address it, and I made a choice to do what I do and believe in what I believe in, follow what I follow.
At one point during my research, I realized it might not be as simple as Jaime being born wired differently from most of us, or having trauma as a child shape his mind to lose empathy. This light bulb moment of sorts happened when Jaime's mother, Michelle, casually mentioned one of Jaime's former defense attorneys, sitting her down, trying to explain some tests they'd run on Jaime. She said something about doctors looking at his brain and seeing actual physical damage, trauma. She said the attorney explained Jaime being thrown out of a moving car as a baby may have affected him in ways Michelle couldn't imagine. If you recall, Michelle said Jaime landed upright in his car seat and he wasn't brought to the hospital. I wanted to see those medical documents myself, which Jaime's former attorneys explained wasn't possible. Those records were sealed under medical privacy laws. If Jaime does really have brain trauma from a childhood head injury, he's not alone in terms of self-proclaimed thrill killers go. Some documented cases of serial killers who had head injuries at a young age include John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown.
John Wayne Gacy was also Pogo the Clown, who loved to make kids laugh.
And Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker.
Los Angeles was under siege. Death waited in the dark at the hands of a man they called the Night Stalker.
Serial killer comes about by circumstances and like a recipe: poverty, drugs, child abuse.
Gacy and Ramirez also both had abusive, violent childhoods. But as with everything, when it comes to attempting to understand what makes someone a serial killer, it's not that black and white. Some prolific serial killers didn't have abusive childhoods or head injuries, like Ted Bundy.
He was at once bright, articulate, and a monster.
As far as anyone can tell, nothing particularly bad ever happened to him as a child, and his brain was studied after execution. No signs of trauma were discovered. Had Jaime gone to trial for Yvette Peña's murder, his turbulent childhood, mental health, and brain damage likely would have been presented to jurors. His background wouldn't have helped him get off for the murder per se. Rather, that information would have been presented during the part of the death penalty trial called the penalty phase, where after one is found guilty of murder, jurors must decide if a defendant should be executed, sent to death row, or given life without the possibility of parole. I've often wondered if jurors would have felt sympathy for Jaime, if such a thing is possible.
No, not at all. He wouldn't have let that happen.
Prosecutor Nick Lackey.
I think as good as his attorneys are and as much respect as I have for them, he was not going to let them do that. He would have been Jaime Osuna over there at the table every day, and the jury would have not only seen that, but would have, I think, felt sorry for the defense attorneys when they got up and tried to portray him as a victim for having to make that argument with a straight face. Yeah, it goes back to his image. I think he doesn't want people to look at him as a, hurt or scared little kid. He wants them to look at him as the devil, and the devil doesn't get hurt.
But that hurt and scared little boy seems to be the only image Jaime's mother can see.
Do you agree that he is a sociopath that has no ability to actually really feel emotions?
No, well, I don't know I don't even know how to answer that question. He has emotions and love towards his family.
Michelle, do you remember how you felt when you found out that Jaime had been arrested for murder, for murdering Yvette Peña?
Oh my gosh, my heart just sank. I couldn't believe believe it. It was a dark day for me. I'll just put it like that.
When did you actually start believing that he really did this?
When you did the interview and he admitted to it.
What was that like?
It was really bad. I stopped watching at that point. I paused it because I couldn't comprehend. I could not deal with what was coming out of his mouth at the time.
So up until that point, you really didn't think he was capable of that?
No, I didn't think he was capable of that. So I can't believe any human being would be capable of that. What was he feeling? You know, things like that. I still think about all that.
People think when someone is able to do those things to a person that means that they don't have a heart.
Yeah, and it'd be very easy for them to think that. But on the other hand, what brings a person, to do something like that? I mean, nothing should be able to bring the person to do something like that. But then there's a lot of people who are fortunate enough not to go through what Jaime went through growing up either. He didn't have that wonderful childhood going to Disneyland and, family trips and, things like that, like a lot of other people, did. He didn't have that.
But the issue with that argument is obvious. What about everyone else who went through abuse similar to Jaime's, perhaps even worse, and didn't turn out to be a killer?
I mean, people who say, like you said, well, I had this type of childhood, I didn't turn out like that. Well, they're one of the lucky ones. I mean, they were just more able to adjust and deal. They were able to adjust and deal with the abuse better than Jaime was.
Maybe so. And perhaps, even if most people don't turn out like Jaime, maybe Michelle is right to give mothers out there this warning.
The fact is that I just want people to understand, if you put the wrong man in your house, something like this can happen. Because you'll be very lucky if you come in and meet a man that's going to turn around and love your kids as much as you do.
The fact that he has talked publicly about enjoying torturing and murdering a woman, did that ever make you feel like you maybe didn't love him anymore? Make it hard to love him?
No, not at all. Not at all. I don't want anybody getting the wrong idea that I condone any of this, because I don't. Whatever people do in life, they have to pay for what they do in life. Anything wrong they do. But that's separate from how I still feel about my son. I still love him. He's still my son. How do you stop loving your child?
Michelle says she can't imagine the pain the mothers of Jaime's victims feel every day.
No parent should have to receive their child in pieces, should I say.
She wants them to know she grieves for them. And to Jaime, she wants him to know this.
I'd just like to tell him that I love him, and that I'm here for him, and that I'm trying to understand, and that I need him to help me understand.
During my research on Jaime's childhood, his family tree, and his supposedly abusive stepfather Jeff's sister said this to me.
There's definitely one thing I don't know that I go back to is, okay, Jeff said Jaime's obviously going to be on death row, so why does it matter? Well, it does matter, I guess, if you wanted to get to the core, the heart of the whole situation, and answers whys and hows and the ifs, so I guess there's that.
And that's exactly why. The whys, the hows, and what ifs, which to some people may not matter, but to my news station, it does. But as far as making Jaime into a victim, that's not how we see him. If there was ever any chance of that, it went out the window as soon as I heard the story of a true victim, Yvette Pena. That's next time on The Man with 1,000 Faces. The Man with 1,000 Faces is written and reported by me, Olivia LaVoice. Maricel Maldonado is our editor and sound mixer. Patricia Rocha is our executive producer. Michael Trihey is our news director. For photos and bonus content, go to 1000facespodcast.com. Copyright Nexstar Media Group, Incorporated. If you like this story, please check out another project of ours, one we call Murdered and Forgotten. Our focus is identifying 2 Jane Does, both brutally murdered in 1980. We know who the killer is, but this story isn't over until we know who the victims are and can bring them home to their families. There are so many clues. Please go to murderedandforgotten.com.